when I was a kid, and obviously it's a long time ago, but when I was a kid, we didn't have TV. In fact, we didn't have TV in my house until I was like 16, 17, something like that. So I grew up listening to the radio. And I remember an Irish film director, Jim Sheridan, a few years ago said that radio was actually a very visual medium, because when you're just listening to people telling stories and people talking together, it conjures up images in your head. So when you've done your research and you know something about the person, you know something about what they're really into, you start the conversation there and you get their enthusiasm, you get them warmed up. So you get them to share what it is they're really into, why they're into it, what they get from it, what they love about it, what they hate about it, maybe the disappointments as well as the pleasure. And that makes them much more real to your audience. And then the conversation just goes, it becomes a conversation rather than an interview.
Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. Today on the podcast, we have Joseph McGuire. What I loved about my conversation with Joseph is that he talks about ways to become better communicators, not just with in-person communication, but reading people's facial features. And as podcast hosts, that is something that is really important to us, right? When we have people on our show, we need to be able to communicate with them effectively to get their points across. We also talk about, if you're a guest on a show, how to really be able to show up with our body language and with our communication skills to be a better guest. Last point is that we also talked about if you're on a show where maybe there isn't video, so you can't see your host, you can't see the guest, and sometimes it can be a little hard to have those conversations. So what are some key things to do before the conversation as well as during the conversation to ensure that we're bringing out the best in the host and the guest? All right, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Joseph to the podcast. Hello, Joseph. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm very, very, very excited to chat with you. If you could start by telling everyone who you are, what you do, and about your business.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alessia, for the invitation. Absolutely delighted to be here, and I love your energy. I've done so many podcast interviews over the years, and some people are just it's just kind of mundane, but you've got life, you've got energy, you've got spark. So that's one of the most welcoming things for a guest. So thank you so much. So yeah, I'm Joseph McGuire. My business is called ClearSight Communications, and it's called ClearSight because what I do is I read people. I read people's faces, micro expressions, body language. I also listen for what's behind what people are saying. I was a therapist for like 30 years. My background is in traditional Oriental medicine. So I spent a lot of time reading people, paying attention again to what was really going on in their lives. The fact that they made an appointment for a back problem or migraine or whatever it was didn't tell me what the real problem was. So I was sort of reading between the lines, reading behind the scenes sort of thing. So now I work primarily with business people. I help people with negotiation, particularly the behavioral side of negotiation, because even when people are very experienced, that even at a very high level with negotiation, so many people get really stressed before, during, and then they're just completely wiped out afterwards. So I help people with that side of it, but also reading the people across the table, whether that's a real table or a virtual table. And I help teams with sales. Again, the whole thing of reading the people, because the fact that technically we're speaking the same language does not mean we're speaking the same language. One of our most famous writers, and I'm Irish, by the way, one of our most famous writers was a guy called Oscar Wilde, like 100 years ago, 100 more than that. And one of his quotes was that Britain and the United States are two countries divided by a common language. But now, no matter where we're living in multicultural land where even though we're speaking English, for so many people, English is not their first language. So what might be common terms for us, common words for us, may have a completely different meaning for them. Like for example, my partner's Chinese, and she's still shall we say, developing her English. So I have to be very tuned in to where she's really coming from and not just speak as I would normally speak to like one of my buddies here.
That is such a great point. I'm even thinking about like, as a mom, right? My youngest is 6. And this morning he was talking to his older brother and he was like, oh, I don't like it. I don't love it. I adore it. And so the younger one was like, what does that mean? What does adore mean? Is this good or is this bad? Right? Like, I can't really tell from what you're saying. And so the same thing goes for like when you're learning something new or you're both know English, right? Or you're just like, in the context, I feel like I might know what this means, but I'm not exactly sure. So I can definitely see how that is quite interesting, right? And how we don't really know how much of what we're expressing or what we're trying to express is actually coming through in the conversation.
Absolutely. And that's a big part of how I help people because, like I said, I work with reading people's faces. That's a very ancient Chinese skill. It's a 3,000-year-old tradition. And I can, like, a lot of my clients will send me photographs. So I can tell a lot about an individual from a photo. So, like, I can tell about how people need to be communicated with. So, like, just to give a little illustration, when we look at somebody's eyebrows, it can tell a lot about how they like to receive and process information. So, for example, if the eyebrows are basically straight across, these are people who need information presented in a very logical, structured manner. So if we start talking in very abstract terms to them, we lose their attention quickly. Where if the eyebrows are more kind of curved, these are more person-centered. So we don't get into data straight away. It's not, okay, we're here to do business. We need to, check in. How are you doing? How are you feeling today? How did you get here? How's the form kind of thing? And just be nice and loose and hang out. And then if, like, my eyebrows, as you can see, are pretty thick. So if you're explaining something or if you're making a proposal to me, trying to sell me something, if you see that the eyebrows are thick like that, you need to give all the information. Because if somebody's got thick eyebrows and they think or they feel you're holding something back, again, it's like, whoa, shutters come down very quickly. So just looking at somebody's eyebrows can tell you a lot. And yes, I am aware that many women shape their eyebrows. So you have to take that into account.
Yes. I think what I love about what you just said was that when we're articulating things, it's not about how we like to articulate things, that it's about how the other person needs to receive the information or how best it is. And I think that's such a missed thing when we're communicating with other people, especially when it comes to things that are near and dear to our heart or are really important to us. We tend to take a very personal, I guess selfish is probably the word I'm looking for, view of how can I articulate this? And in relationships, whether that's with the person that you have on your show or your spouse or your kids or a coworker, it has to be communicated, yes, in a way that you feel you're articulating it correctly, but also in a way that they can receive the information that you're giving, so that otherwise you're just kind of talking at someone, which is never what we really want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the thing most of us don't tend to realize is before we speak, we're already communicating. Like when you get into neuroscience, you're talking about things like mirror neurons. What they've demonstrated is that our energy, our vibe, if you like, is communicating. So that's already happening before we say anything. And then we have to take into account who the other person is, not who we think they are, but we have to look to, if we want to have any kind of meaningful communication, whether that's, like you say, in our personal lives or our business lives, we have to take into account who they are, where they're at. Otherwise, it's a hugely missed opportunity.
Yeah. So let's talk podcasting, right? Obviously, this is why people are here. They want to know more about podcasting and being better podcasters. Let's start with solo episodes, right? So if you have a video first podcast, so meaning that you are going to have more of a video approach to your podcast. Yes, you'll have the audio side, but you are talking at your camera. what are some things that we can do, since you mentioned that starts before you even start talking, those visual cues and that communication? What are some ways that we can show ourselves to be knowledgeable, to be trustworthy to the people who are finding us?
Yeah. The first thing is always practice smiling. Become accustomed to a real full smile where your eyes show you're smiling. That's the first thing. And in a lot of business circles, they talk about know, like, and trust. The reality is the trust bit comes first. We don't tend to realize that. And now, I know it's important to build trust in a relationship, but instinctively we get a sense of whether we can trust somebody or not. So the first thing is that openness. Is the smile real, or is it that it's just the mouth, like the so-called social smile, or as a photographer friend of mine says, it's the bridesmaid smile. Where the bridesmaid is standing off to the side and, I wish I was the center of attention. So the first thing is the smile. And then it's to make sure we have done our research, that we know who the guest is. And that, like, I've been interviewed on, I don't know how many podcasts, and some of them have come on, and the interviewer is like asking me, okay, who are you? Where did you come from? I was like, really? So it's a very obvious thing. And like, I know you've done your homework, and I know that because that's one of the reasons I said, yes, I'd love to be on. But some people don't. So it's really important. And not just their name and the name of the business, but you may want to check out like their social media profile. What are their hobbies? What are they interested in? If you like dogs, do they like dogs, kind of thing? You look for commonalities. So you, even before the interview starts, maybe have a short chat. So you break the ice and you check if they have any concerns. And is there anything they need to know about you? Is there anything they need to know about the program? And like, you do this, so that's natural for you. But again, some people don't even think of it. When you do that, when you reach out to people, again, it fills them with a sense of trust. Oh yeah, again, like this is safe for me. And as we know, some people, both getting into podcasts and some people coming on as guests, are very nervous in front of a camera. Some people, it's the last thing I want to do. So things like that, again, the smile, but reaching out to them beforehand and just checking in and asking, just asking human questions. What are you into? Like I say, check on social media. Check if they refer to their families, if they refer to pets, if they refer to activities, sports, music, movies, whatever it might be. So you've got something to share. And even if it's not something you're interested in, do a little bit of research about it and just talk about how their team did at the weekend. Well, especially if they won. Or even commiserate with them if the team lost. Again, it just breaks the ice, because that's the whole thing. And you've touched on such an important point there. Once your guest feels at ease with you, the conversation can flow. And it's so, so important, because really what you're doing as a podcast host is like you're welcoming them into your home, into your world. And when they feel welcome, it's like, you may not see it happening, but it's like they go, oh, that's a relief. And they relax. And then you feel it, and yeah, this is a good one.
Yeah, it is definitely difficult. I've been a guest on shows where, the person was maybe leaning back, had their arms behind their head, or kind of looking off as I was talking. And I'm someone who tends to match the energy of the person that I'm talking to, especially if they are leading the conversation. If I'm leading, we're just going with my energy and it's going to be excited. So like it was so hard to show up as how I would have loved to show up because of how the person was. And I've been on other ones where the person is excited and they're engaged and they're like, oh, wow, this is really interesting. Or wait, let's go back to that because that was really cool. And that gives a completely different way that I feel that I can really show up as a guest to offer value to the audience. So I think what you're saying is so, so important. So that was as the host. What about as a guest? So my experience, what are some tips, tricks, and strategies that people could potentially use to maybe draw the host with them or to offset that energy if they need to?
To be honest, as a guest, now I've been on a lot of podcasts and I'm obviously not a teenager, so I have a lot of life experience behind me. But if I were to go on a podcast and the host is like doing this and looking away, I'd say, look, this is a waste of time. I would just call it. Like, we're either going to do this properly or let's say goodbye, because you're on a loser if you go with something like that. That's just the reality. But I would call them on it, and I would have no issue doing it. But then I know a lot of people won't have the confidence to do that. But I would recommend speaking up. Like, are we going to do this? Are we going to be serious here? And it'll wake them up at the very least. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, like, as you can see, my background is very, very sparse. Almost bare. There's like a couple of cushions. My book is in the background, kind of thing. So what is it you want to convey? What's the message you want to convey as the guest? And some people, you'll see all sorts of clutter. They don't, because they're just not aware of it. I just prefer it clean. So what is the message you want to convey? Some people, it's like their business, so they'll have a banner, which is perfect. Some people will have, I'm sure you've had it often enough. Some people will have cats and dogs running around the place, and it's fine for me, but it can be a real distraction. So again, you need to be tuned into why you're there. And if you've got cats and dogs who are likely to be running around, you better check with the host, the interviewer, whether this is going to be okay or whether this is going to be a distraction. And especially if the dog starts barking, that's really off-putting. So ideally, you're going to keep dogs, cats, small children out of the room. That's another thing. You check that my lighting is fairly minimal, but it's okay. So you check things like that. You check that you have something to drink beside you, because your mouth is likely to go dry. And if your mouth goes really dry, you're going to pick up a lot of clicks. So something as simple as that. And if you're nervous, make a point of taking a breath, taking a sip of something. Give yourself a moment. Don't overtalk, because I could use an impolite term, but some people talk themselves out of possibilities. We see it a lot in sales, we see it in negotiation, but we can see it in the podcast that people it's like their brain just does a dump. And it's just like they just talk and they go off on all sorts of tangents. So keep it focused. I hope that's useful.
Yes, absolutely. That was really useful. I think that it's really important that we're using those tips, right? Because like you said at the beginning, like, even if we're like, we tell the person, hey, look, like, are we doing this? Is this going to work? That's great. And there are people who are, like myself, a certified people pleaser, who will push through to the end and be like, wow, that was a learning experience for sure. Don't want to do that again. Need to look out for those things. So it all depends on the type of person you are, but those other ways to just, okay, I'm going to be my best. I'm going to do my best, and whatever happens, happens. And remember that you don't have to be the person to promote that episode if they didn't let you really show up as your best self, right? I think that's really important.
Yeah.
What are some ways, because yes, we're talking camera, we're talking in person, but what are some ways that maybe virtually, and maybe this is even because I know not all of the podcast recording platforms that we use to talk to guests have video, right? Most of them do now, but they didn't always. And I know some people still do not do video. I like to, because I really like to see the facial expressions, make sure that the energy is there and is good, but that's not always the case for everyone. So if you are, let's start first with, all right, you are a host and you have someone on your show and you want to be able to pick up on some of those cues that you mentioned, those body language cues that we can look for. What are some things that we should be looking for? And then we'll move over to the more voice ones after we talk about interviewing via video. You put your heart and your soul into your show. And I want to help you reach all of those potential listeners out there. That's why I'm excited to announce my upcoming podcast marketing workshop. It's about giving you practical tools to grow your audience. You'll learn the secrets to getting your podcast discovered, attracting your dream listeners, and boosting those download numbers. This workshop will be hosted live with a replay available on April 30th. You can sign up by going to galatimedia.com/workshop. Let's grow our podcasts together.
Sure. As the host first of all, like you're full of energy, and that's utterly natural to you. Where if you were to just try and hold yourself really stiff, you would lose so much. You would feel it emotionally. You'd feel so constricted, and it just wouldn't work. What you want somebody also, when you have a guest on, you want a guest who's got energy. Again, you don't want somebody who's just sitting there and, oh, yeah, because again, it just kills the show. This is more for people who don't have your experience. You have to choose your guests wisely. Just that they may be known in a particular niche, a particular industry. They may have, X number of followers, whatever. If they don't suit your style, you're going to have to adapt, and you're going to have to work hard to make the episode work. Things like, again, it goes back to things like background and making sure that the person is physically comfortable. Checking, like, obviously I've done this umpteen times, so I make sure I'm sitting comfortably in the chair, because you'll sometimes see interviewers or podcast guests, and they're obviously just not at ease, and they're moving so much that, like, you can almost get seasick watching them. And when that happens, you're not hearing them. There's obvious stuff like, I tend to wear fairly simple colors. So some people like to wear really loud, flashy colors. That can be a distraction, because people may be caught up in the visual and not paying attention to anything that's being said, because the colors can be too distracting. And that can be a question of the camera, or it can be that the colors they're wearing. So just to be conscious of the visual presentation there. And obviously, I want people to pay attention to what I'm saying as much as anything. So I deliberately keep it relatively simple and eliminate as much of the distraction as possible.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you mentioned this before about the background thing. And so I'm someone who, I don't mind some things in my background. Clearly, you can see it. The listeners can't. But there's certain things, and they're there for a reason, right? So like, I've got my giraffes, which make me happy. But I've actually had people send me giraffe stuff because they see that, like, I have lots of giraffe stuff. And so it kind of makes me memorable in that way. And I've got a picture of my mom who passed away, just as like a remembrance of her. I've got like a Lego bonsai tree that my kids made, makes me think of them. So still keeping it very simple, but things that are meaningful to me, right? And help center me in what I'm doing. And I remember having a guest, his name is Joe. We'll make sure we link back to his episode in the show notes, where he had a ton of Star Wars paraphernalia behind him. And I am a huge Star Wars fan. And so like, in our pre-talk of, like, obviously we didn't harp on Star Wars during the episode because that's not relevant to what we were talking about, but it was a connection point, right? And so now when he sees my stories, when I've got my Star Wars graphic tee, he's like, I love the tees. So I think that there are ways that, yes, we can very minimalistically express ourselves. But to your point, especially as a guest coming on, you might not want to have all of that stuff behind you, especially if you are trying to make a sale or get a negotiation, or maybe it's a potential collaboration for business, right? And not all podcasts are going to be that, but they can be, right? They could be lifelong relationships where you want to make sure that you're showing up as your best self. So I love those tips. And I do think it's important that you show up in the way that feels best for you, right? And so if that is you having a whole wall of Star Wars paraphernalia as a talking point, then kudos. But if you're someone like Joseph, who's like, it needs to be more structured and more solid, then I think that's great as well. Now, talking more from the audio side, right? So I know a lot of times when I talk about audio and when I talk about doing solo episodes and sharing stories and being vulnerable on your podcast, a lot of it, and I think this is one reason why I love podcasting, is you can hear that inflection and you can hear the passion behind the topic. And how can we do that from a audio only standpoint, right? So if we're thinking about, as a podcast host who doesn't have the video, I cannot see my guest, but I can hear them, how are some ways that I can kind of bring them along with me in the conversation to make the most of the conversation as well?
That's where you really have to do your research. You have to be very thorough in your research. So you really have to know quite a bit about them, not just about their professional background or whatever it might be. You have to know. So that's where you go into your social media. You can even, like, if I were doing it, I would be probably not just looking at their profile, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, wherever they may be, but I would be looking at, who do I know who knows them? and checking in with them. Can you tell me anything about them? Not like deep, dark secrets, but anything that they're really into that we can share that will just bring out the best in them. So that's one avenue I would certainly be looking at, because the preparation is going to be absolutely essential. And you need to have icebreakers where it's just audio, where it just eases them into the conversation. And it makes it, particularly when it's audio. Like I remember when I was a kid, and obviously it's a long time ago, but when I was a kid, we didn't have TV. In fact, we didn't have TV in my house until I was like 16, 17, something like that. So I grew up listening to the radio. And I remember an Irish film director, Jim Sheridan, a few years ago said that radio was actually a very visual medium, because when you're just listening to people telling stories and people talking together, it conjures up images in your head. So when you've done your research and you know something about the person, you know something about what they're really into, you start the conversation there. And you get their enthusiasm, you get them warmed up. So you get them to share what it is they're really into, why they're into it, what they get from it, what they love about it, what they hate about it, maybe the disappointments as well as the pleasure. And that makes them much more real to your audience. And then the conversation just goes, it becomes a conversation rather than an interview. And that's really, I mean, you know that's what you really want. You want a conversation. You don't want people to, as a listener or as a guest, you don't want them to think, oh, that was question one. Now we move on to question two. And now we've got these questions on the list that we have to go through, because you don't want it to be like that, because that just sounds rigid. So the thorough preparation, make sure you know who they really are before you get them on, and then talk about what they love, what they hate, the disappointments, the happy moments, all that stuff that brings out them, and you hear it in their voice.
Yeah, I love both of those points. I think that second one, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a client this week where they were like, oh, we're replying to the guest saying, oh, that's a really interesting point, and then kind of moving on in the conversation. Is that boring? Is there a better way to do that? And so I told them, that's a fine way to do it. And a lot of people do it that way. And as you're learning to be a better interviewer and a better host, you will find that it's a little better because obviously you could do what you want with your podcast. It's your podcast. But here are some tips, tricks, strategies that I like to see. And that is like saying, wow, that's really interesting. I feel like that is best for XYZ kind of person. It shows that you're an expert. It shows that you know what you're talking about. And it makes it more of a conversation. Yes, you can still stick to your questions if those make you feel safer. And it allows you to have a more conversational style to the show. And he was like, oh, yeah, that's a really good idea. Okay, cool. So I love that you mentioned that, because I think that is really important, especially for newer podcasters who are maybe a little nervous to go off the cuff, to kind of wing it. It's okay. You can always edit it later, guys. If there's a question, you're like, that was a bad one. You can go edit it later. And I love, you've mentioned this a few times, and I think it definitely should be something that we reiterate here. And that is being picky about the people that you have on your show and really choosing them with care, because it's not just about being a people pleaser and saying, oh, well, you asked to be on my show, so I'm going to let you be on my show. You always have to think about the audience and what it is that they want to hear, what it is that they want to know, and if this person is the best person to talk about this topic to your audience. So I love that you've mentioned that a few times, and I think that that's something that we can definitely take away from this conversation, not just in the ways that we can better communicate, but also be particular about the people that we allow into these interviewing spaces.
Yeah, and there's another tip there, and it just reminds me of some of the work I do, because like I mentioned, working with negotiation, but this is something I got from a guy called Chris Voss. And Chris Voss, his book on negotiation is I think it's probably the best-selling book on negotiation globally. It's called Never Split the Difference, and he's a former chief hostage negotiator for the FBI. But one of the things he talks about is called mirroring. And mirroring involves, you need to be really tuned in, because he would have done a lot of work listening to people on the end of a phone, talking to hostage takers, etc. So you need to be well tuned in to changes in the pitch, the rhythm of the voice, where the voice goes up, where the voice goes down, or it was fast and suddenly it's slow. You need to be alert to things like that. But it's a tactic strategy he uses, where when you know there's something really interesting there and you get just a really strong sense that they haven't said it, but you know there's another little gem in there. You just repeat the last 2 to 3 words of the last sentence they have spoken, but with the inflection as if it were a question. You were in town today?
Yeah.
You went to the store? Things like that. And it's the implication is you're asking them a question, but you're not. And you just give a few seconds of silence. 3 to 4 seconds of silence is usually enough, and they will follow on.
That is such a great tip, I think, especially for if maybe someone's a little of a drier guest, right? We've all had those where it's kind of a little pulling to pull the information, or maybe they're nervous, right? Like that happens. So I think that's a great strategy and a great tip. I would never have thought about it, but as you were saying, I was like, I've seen those movies with like the hostage negotiations where I've seen them do that. And yes, it works. And you're right. We always want to fill that silence just as humans, especially when it makes us nervous. So, that's so good. Joseph, thank you so much for being on today. This has been so extremely informative and helpful. If you can let everybody know where they can find you, hang out with you, connect with you online, and then we'll make sure that we have links for all of that in the show notes as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, and just love your energy. And I love the giraffes as well, by the way, because I've got this thing, I don't show them on screen, but I've got this thing about frogs.
Oh, I love it.
People used to just give me frogs from all sorts of places, all sorts of colors and shapes. So, so I get the giraffe thing. Yeah, I'm most active on LinkedIn. So that's where you'll find me. I do have a website, which is clearsightcommunications.com, but I do need to do a lot of updating on it. So LinkedIn is the place to find me.
Awesome. We'll make sure we link both, and that way people can find you no matter what time. By the time it's all fixed up, or now, who cares? They can find you, connect with you, and hang out with you. Again, thank you so much, Joseph. I appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure, Leslie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.